This is a panel about fallibility, the risk of predictions, the limitations of experts, all that kind of good stuff. We can share war stories later about the craziest thing you've heard so far at Milken or something that anything like that's totally fair game. And I think we've got a really great panel for having this conversation. So what I'll do is ask, starting over here on my right with Sam, ask everyone to just briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll launch into matters here. So Sam.
So I'm Sam Arbesman. I'm a senior scholar at the Kauffman Foundation, and my background is in complexity science, and I explore how scientific and technological change inform changes in what we know, so essentially the future of knowledge and how to adapt to it.
Wow. I'm Zachary Carabell. I'm the head of global strategy at InvestNet, which is a publicly traded financial services firm. I also write a weekly column for Slate called The Edgy Optimist, and do some commenting on CNBC and MSNBC, and I'm a serial book writer. Meaning I write a lot of books. I don't write books about cereal.
I'm Bethany McLean. I'm a contributing editor at Vanity Fair, and I guess somewhat accidentally I have made a career out of writing about stories of business gone wrong.
Good morning. I'm John Rohal. I'm chairman of Man Group's North American operations. Man is a global investment management firm specializing in absolute return products.
So I just realized I already made a mistake. I forgot to introduce myself. So I'm Paul Kudrowski. I'm a contributing editor at Bloomberg, managing partner of a little venture fund called SK Ventures, and I screw around a lot on Twitter. What I thought we could do is maybe sort of open up with sort of a preamble, and talk a little bit about the whole notion of fallibility and expertise. One of my favorite stories in all of this is it was from Michael Crichton of Andromeda Strain and Jurassic Park fame, where he had coined this great notion of the Gell-Mann amnesia effect. I don't know if you've ever sort of run into this before, but his notion was is when you're reading the paper, you'll read a story about something that you actually know something about, and all the way through you're just shaking your head saying this is completely idiotic. What in the world? The journalist thinks this is true, to the point that often the case that they'll reverse causality, that wet streets cause rain kind of notion, right? Get things completely backwards. And you'll read it through and you'll be like, this is just nonsense. And then you'll turn to the next article in the paper as if that prior experience never happened, right? And you'll just, oh, this is a great article about Palestine or about Facebook or about whatever else. The amnesia kicks in immediately, right? We're so trusting in the word of experts. It doesn't matter that we've got direct firsthand experience that the prior article was nonsense, because as soon as we turn to the next one, I'm totally willing to go with it, all over again. So with that as kind of at least one of the ideas that's sort of driving the conversation, what I thought we could do is maybe open it up and maybe start with Sam and talk a little bit about, what are some of the domains and areas where we're most prone to seeing, problems, where there are real limits to expertise and real limits to what we can, reliably predict or even, imagine experts having some ability to predict. I know this is one of Sam's sort of favorite areas. So.
Yeah, and so I'm coming from complexity science. I think a lot about complex systems, and I think they're really the most interesting things, and they kind of they're most of the domains that we also experience. And when we think about complex systems, and these are pretty much when you have parts that interact in complicated ways, and that can be everything. It can be a social system, so people interacting in a society in certain ways. It can be biological. It can be everything from proteins all the way up to ecosystems. It can be technological, so you have technological systems, everything from the internet to other sorts of networks. But then it becomes, the major question then becomes, how are those pieces connected? Because that'll really dictate whether or not you can actually have some expertise or make some sort of prediction about these systems. And on the one extreme, you have systems where the pieces are really tightly coupled. And so essentially, it's almost like some sort of crystal, where everything is really easily connected. And it's actually very easy to deal with these kinds of systems. So when they're tightly connected, that's fine. You can make predictions very nicely and easily, and it's fine. On the other extreme, you have a situation where all little pieces are relatively independent or very loosely coupled. And in those situations, it's also pretty easy, because then you have something akin to a gas or static on a television screen, where each piece, maybe you can't predict the individual component, but you aggregate up and you just run some statistics and it's fine. In between, though, that's the sweet spot, where things are not quite independent, but they're also interacting in complicated ways, where you have nonlinear interaction. So rather than things being proportional, the outputs being proportional to the inputs, you have things where small change can yield a big output, or vice versa. You can have a really big change that might actually not do very much at all. And trying to understand how those interconnections operate, that's really where it's most difficult. And that's also all the domains that we deal with. Pretty much social systems where people have minds of their own, but are also basing their interactions on others. That is the type of complex systems that are most fascinating to complexity scientists. And you actually can do research. You can actually figure out kind of the types of behaviors of these systems. The problem then becomes when you try to predict with precision what is going to happen. You can't do that. What you can rather do, and I think this is the proper domain of experts in these kinds of complex systems, is simply place bounds on your surprise and say, okay, these are the different ways and different kinds of things that can happen, and this should kind of give us a sense of what's going to occur, rather than saying, this is exactly what's going to happen. I think that's the proper way to think about these kind of complex systems.
Are we getting any better at it?
We'd like to think so. I think
It's getting people tenure.
Yeah, I think we're better at realizing all the different ways that complex systems work and how unpredictable they are. So I think, yeah, a lot of papers are being published about how kind of like the large statistical regularities of these systems. Unfortunately, they might only explain like 30% of the variation, and the remaining 70%, that's the really important stuff and where we actually want to be able to predict. And unfortunately, we can't do that. And I think when we make the mistake and assume that we actually do understand a good amount of the variation, that's the problem.
So Zachary, I mean, most of us, I think, in this room would think of economics and financial markets as examples of complex systems, and our sort of favorite whipping boys and girls are economists. They're what's the old joke? Economists famously predicted like 8 of the last 2 recessions or something like that. Is that the nature of the beast when you're dealing in financial markets, that inherently we're always going to have? I mean, we're always going to have experts perpetually wrong because it's essentially a falsification engine, right? I mean, it's something that's throwing out so many outcomes every day, all the time, that you're either going to get a prediction right or prediction wrong. But there's just so much noise, we're stuck with this problem.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I like to say that I'm not an economist, but I play one on TV. I mean, I was trained as an historian and political science, so I had and I did economics as part of that, and then kind of learned economics as part of being a Wall Street practitioner, but never developed an appropriate level of reverence for the ability of these patterns to be predictive. And that either makes me heretical or correct or somewhere in between, depending on your perspective. But it is striking, in terms of complex systems, how completely wrong and unable we are collectively to really gauge market behavior or economic futures, and whether that's market participants, whether that's people making projections of returns, absolute return. You can talk about the difficulty of even projecting what that's going to be. Whether that's the Congressional Budget Office, making long-term projections about the effect of current spending on future deficits or future budget patterns. I mean, if you looked at the legacy of the Congressional Budget Office, and I don't say this to be critical of the CBO per se, it's just, if you develop a group that is by sort of mandate has to make a 10 to 20 year projection of the effects of current spending, you have to embed all these assumptions. What's your economic growth going to be? What's your rate of inflation going to be? What are your tax receipts going to be? And you're left with, in order to come up with numbers, these all things being equal arguments, when observably in human society, all things are never equal and nothing is ever static. And so it shouldn't surprise us that these projections end up being wrong. It's not like that they were wrong and therefore they could have been and should have been right. It's the whole expectation that they could have been right given the fluidity of these systems and the fact that none of these numbers are static. And as I point out in this book that I just wrote called The Leading Indicators, which I'm told is for sale somewhere, and I find that absolutely fascinating. That we don't even have, these numbers haven't existed long enough in an economic framework for us to create any certainty about future outcomes. And so, I mean, this is an area where the assumption of expertise creating foreknowledge of human events is at some of its most limited. It's limited almost anywhere. I mean, people always try to look at the perfect moment in the past. Historians, what moment can we look at that's the perfect analogy for decision making in the present, in the belief that somehow this idea has come to be a cliche of, history repeats itself, so you can find the pattern and predict into the future. History does not repeat itself. Historians repeat each other, and maybe there are patterns that rhyme, but every moment, and this is just my opinion, I'm just a guy with an opinion, and the cult of expertise is a whole other thing. Someone on Twitter, every now and then I'll get something on Twitter where someone will say, "No one cares what you think." And I'll think, well, then, why are you writing me? So, we believe that these things are possible. We want these things to be possible, and yet the legacy of them being possible is scattered at best. Every now and then someone is spectacularly right because events evolve in a way that is consistent with what they thought it might, but then replicating that rightness, in the future is incredibly rare. And my general take on this is most of the things that animate us about the arc of societies, and certainly about economic systems, are not binary. They are fluid. And it's hard enough to figure out binary events. I mean, learning to predict elections has been difficult, but we've gotten somewhat good about sampling. But complicated systems where reality keeps changing underneath it, where all things are not equal, where nothing is in fact constant, I don't even think we should be trying, because I don't think there are any cookies there. There's no way of gaming out something that is inherently non-gameable. And we could talk, I suppose, and I'll finish there, of, okay, what do you do then? That shouldn't be a recipe for, I don't know, paralysis. It just means maybe it's more about probabilities, maybe it's more about humility about one's ability to analyze fluid systems and look for probabilities. Maybe there's a lot of unscientific touch, feel, and intuition. But I'm very skeptical of the endeavor. And I know that in a financial world is deeply, deeply unsatisfying, often frustrating, and sometimes angering to people when I say that. But there you go.
Do we have, Bethany, should we blame journalists for a lot no,
I see some nods in the audience.
Yes, right
This
away.
is
Okay,
bad.
fair enough, we'll stop. Next question, John. No, I mean, just in the sense that, and you brought this up on the caller when we were talking about it, that, you've got a story to tell, and we have to tell it using the voices that we have available, and some of those voices are going to be experts. And not only that, it's going to be the experts who called you back.
Right. So I think as human beings, we have this deep need to make sense of our world. And I think you can see that in two ways, either in math and finance through modeling, and in journalism through storytelling. And both are in some ways a similar exercise, which is that you're collecting inputs into your model, right? And I was a math major, so I've been told that you can see that in my writing, which is probably not a good thing either. But anyway, and one of the first things you learn as a math major and doing models is garbage in, garbage out, right? And so one of the things as a journalist you're doing when you're writing a story is you're trying to get as many different perspectives as you can, and you are limited in that by a number of factors. One may be time. Unfortunately, that's not often an excuse in my case. I write for a magazine. I have plenty of time. Another is your own creativity and finding people to talk to, your own energy and reaching out to those people. And a third is then those people calling you back and telling you what you need to know. When I wrote a story back in 2000 about Enron, and it was a critical story about the company, the CEO at the time, Jeff Skilling, called me back and he said, what I think many people feel when they read a piece by a journalist or are told a journalist is doing a piece, he said, you are so unethical to be doing this story, because if you had a clue, you would realize how stupid your questions are. And the scary thing about that is that can actually always be true. You can be completely off base. And I always feel when I'm writing, there's this one moment I have where I've sort of achieved clarity. And the fact that I get there is accidental most of the time. I found somebody who seems to have clarified it for me, and maybe it's just an illusion. You're only as good as your inputs, and I think that's true in financial modeling, and it's true in journalism. But I think this deep underlying need to make sense of the world is a very human thing, and I don't think that's going away, even if it should.
So, John, I mean, taking that a step further, is part of the problem that, to Bethany's point about being wrong about Enron or being right about Enron, there's a great line, and Catherine Schultz has this great book called Being Wrong, where she talks about what it feels like to be wrong. And the answer, of course, is it feels exactly like being right? Because you don't know that you're wrong until you find out that you're wrong. So being wrong feels exactly like being right, and that's a problem, right? So is one of the merits then, if you bring this over, this whole discussion of fallibility and the limits of expertise, over to financial markets, that at least on a regular basis there's a dependent variable coming back at you telling you that there's a pretty good chance you're wrong here. So is that one of the merits then of finance, that at least in markets you're getting a signal telling you, unlike another where we can hold these completely loony views with impunity, in markets can we get away with holding loony views with impunity?
Well, it's a really good question, and I think time is sometimes an important part of the discussion. In other words, am I right or wrong, and in what time frame am I right or wrong? because the world continues to evolve. And
Right.
so a lot of people like finance because they feel there is a measuring element to it, and Warren Buffett talked a lot about the voting machine versus the weighing machine. And there's a lot of voting that goes on a very short-term basis. And over a longer period of time, fundamentals will rule the day, and therefore there's a weighing machine that ultimately decides whether you were right or wrong. The ability to really determine, though, rightness and wrongness, I think, requires some important characteristics, and one of them is to be willing in the short term to be wrong and to hold your conviction and have a real understanding of what the measurement markers are. So how did you reach a conclusion? What are the measurements along the path to that conclusion? How are they evolving toward that path? And will they ultimately get there, or do you have to change your mind? And so it's a delicate balance between, what you really believe is the right outcome, but at the same point in time, how do the fundamentals give you evidence of whether you're on the right path or not?
There's a great line on that point. There's a great line in, I don't know, one of Michael Lewis's books, not the current one, but where he says something about some people are willing to pay an ungodly high premium for one day being able to say, "I told you so." Right? I mean, that you're going to, I'll hang in forever despite evidence to the contrary, just because I feel like, weighing and voting machines and I want to hang in, and eventually I'll get a chance to say, "I told you so." I'm going to be bearish for 25 years and I get to say, "I told you so" on a 4% decline or something like that.
Well, it's surviving the path is one of the favorite, conversations that people have. Do you have the ability to really survive whatever path you feel you're waiting for relative to the outcome? And it becomes a really difficult issue in terms of when you concede versus where do you think the ultimate win is. Before the global financial crisis, a lot of people believed that events were going to unfold in a certain fashion, and they bet negatively against the amount of liquidity in the system. But they couldn't survive the path. So they deserted investments, Julian Robertson in 1999,
Right.
or early 2000.
Right.
Same thing.
Where they just sort of couldn't take the pain anymore.
That's right.
Let's we're going to sort of bridge over to how we sort of manage our relationships with experts and these frailties. But I want to talk first a little bit about, get people talking about the nature of expertise. Because one of the weird dynamics here is that experts, as you learn more and more about a domain, eventually you realize that most people are morons, right? Because they don't know nearly as much as you do about the subject. So all you have to do is go to your local DMV to realize what an idiot you are, because look at how much more they know about vehicle licensing than I do. And the reverse also happens, right? Where you're sitting there and you're watching experts fail repeatedly at predictions, right? Whether it's about financial markets or about climate change, or pick your favorite hobby horse, you watch them fail repeatedly, so you become ungodly cynical about experts. So this is an incredible tension that exists, right? So on the one hand, we have experts completely cynical about the people listening to what they're saying, and we have individuals completely cynical about the nonsense that experts are spewing. How do we make a market here? How do you reconcile this? Or is this just a fundamental tension that's never going to go away? I mean, is it that we're going to have a complete breakdown where it's just like you guys get your island, we get our island, and we just stop paying attention?
There's a huge difference between expertise, acumen, and knowledge, right? So I have this argument with my older son, who's constantly telling his younger brother, not for any good reasons, just because he's his younger brother, that all of his friends are stupid, and because they're younger and they don't know as much, and trying to indicate to him after I've beaten him senseless for being so cruel to his younger brother, that the lack of knowledge is not a sign of lack of intelligence or lack of ability, and we confuse this constantly in terms of experts. From a journalist perspective, are often just people who know something about the topic that you don't, right? That doesn't then mean that their ability to take and use that knowledge is in any way so much more wise or far-seeing or predictive than the kind of the horse sense person, right? And I do think those are different. There are a lot of people with intense knowledge about something that is incredibly valuable that we can tap into as resources. We do not all share the same knowledge base. We all haven't spent the same amount of time learning mathematics or learning about investments or studying systems and theories. But that doesn't then, in my view at least, translate into a better ability to think about what those future outcomes are, with the exception of very closed systems. And I think that's endemic, in our culture, where we constantly are conflating those. Like, oh, you know something, therefore you must know about how these things are going to have interplay. And that, there's a huge breakdown there.
But and to take it one step further, is part of the problem this kind of belief that there's someone out there who knows, but maybe they're just not taking calls. You know what I mean? There's a specialist. There's someone who understands my malady. There's someone in financial markets who I can turn to who actually knows why Amazon's off 22% in 7 days or whatever it is. That there's someone who knows, but they're not talking because they're profiting from this information. Is that one of the reasons?
My one quick line on that. My favorite line in the past years in the financial world has always been, why did markets move that way? You should just say it's the yen carry trade unwinding, right? Because there are no numbers. It's not transparent. Nobody knows how big the yen carry trade was. No one knows who's unwinding it. No one knows who's actually pulling it. But the invocation of it makes it seem like, oh, wow, markets went down because the yen carry trade was unwinding today.
It's going to sound obvious, but that discovery that there wasn't that one person sitting out there has always been shocking to me, was shocking to me when I first worked on my first book about Enron. I thought I'd be able to call people up, and when I finally got somebody to talk to me, assuming someone would actually return my calls, I'd be able to say, how'd you do it? How'd you create the fraud in your area? And most people, to my shock, did not have a clue. And I remember talking to a guy who had worked at Enron in the last year of its life. He was very sophisticated, had worked as an investment banker for the decade preceding, and worked in a bunch of Enron's different businesses, and in each business he'd say to himself, well, this makes no sense. We're booking all these earnings, but cash flow is going out the door. But it'd go back to Enron's offices, which were built overlooking Buckingham Palace in London, and it'd say, the money's got to be coming from somewhere. So I think there's a limitation even on expertise, even in the people that you expect to. But I do think, back to your question about do we just give up, I always think it's kind of transparency of your scaffolding, and I always think of the facts as the scaffolding on which you hang the story. And facts can be slippery little beasts too, so I don't want to imply that facts sort of are truth with a capital T. But if you see the facts somebody is employing or the inputs into their model, then you see the scaffolding they're using to hang their model or their narrative. And then there's transparency about what's interpretation and what's at least a little more stable.
And we talked about this a little bit coming in, but does the internet change any of this at all? We've got this kind of incredible crowd function going on. Look at what's happening with medical papers recently. There's been a number of papers in physics that have been, taken back because of criticisms that came out on the internet. Is the notion of falsifiability and how we decide if something's right or wrong, is at least the half-life of dumb shorter?
I think so.
Maybe it's longer.
It varies. And the thing is, there is this half-life of knowledge where we publish things we think they're true, and then people actually decide to test them again, and it turns out they vanish. And you can measure this, and there's ways of kind of looking at how from field to field these rates of change are occurring. But I think one of the problems with trying to figure out whether or not this rate of kind of fixing things is speeding up or slowing down is who's willing to actually kind of do the work and try to test these things. And as you, not necessarily having experts, but as you have specialists who kind of know more and more about only a smaller and smaller area, it becomes much more difficult to have people outside of that area try to examine it. But it shouldn't be that way. It should be possible to actually have a great deal of openness and kind of transparency, as you were saying. And I think there's now a movement to try to actually be much more open about, at least in science, the methodologies that are occurring in order to make all these things reproducible. Because until quite recently, and if you read a scientific paper, and back in the day when there was no kind of computational components to science or kind of how people made these models, when you read the methods section, that was exactly what they did. Now, though, the methods section is not their methods. It's an advertisement for what they did. It's not actually what they did. And no one really knows what kind of went on into creating this bit of knowledge or this fact. And it's very hard to test and see what's going on. And so now there's this, very recently in the past few years, there's been a movement to try to reproduce well-known results and find out if they actually hold up or not. And this is why a lot of papers are kind of not necessarily being retracted, but are being overturned. And people are trying to put their code online and kind of actually see, okay, what is going on in these models? And so I think, and this way, then you can more easily and transparently see, okay, what are the facts and what are the methodologies underlying these ideas and these predictions? And you can see whether or not, well, in addition, you can also see whether or not their facts are horribly out of date. Because too often in just the field of knowledge, because everything is so siloed and compartmentalized, when a new discovery is made in one field, it takes a long time or it never actually percolates to another field. And so even though something might be horribly out of date, there are other fields that are using that information
Give an
as
example.
gospel.
Can you just give an example, Sam?
Well, so actually in terms of this and not being able to kind of stitch information together, there was a guy, Don Swanson. He's an information scientist. He actually passed away in the past couple of years. Back in the 80s, he realized that this was a big problem, that there was essentially undiscovered public knowledge, that there was knowledge out there if you kind of could comb all of the literature, but was unable to be examined because the literature is so big. So imagine you have kind of, in your area, there's a paper that says A implies B. And somewhere else in the vast scientific literature, there's another paper that says B implies C. Now the problem is because everything in the literature is so large, you've never actually read that other paper. And so even though it could very well be true that A implies C by combining the two papers, you would never realize that. And so Don Swanson decided in the mid-80s to actually test whether or not this was true. And even though he had no particular expertise in medicine, he made a number of fundamental medical discoveries, including one where he found that you could actually help treat a circulatory disorder very easily by taking fish oil pills. And no one had known this because there was no easy way, whether it's through jargon barriers or just simply due to the size of the literature, there's no way to kind of bring that information over. And so there's often either outdated information or kind of incomplete knowledge because the literature is so vast. And so then there are now computational techniques to begin kind of bridging this. But too often, yeah, you have outdated information, whether or not you're simply making very basic mistakes about the number of billions of people on the planet, which is, that's a pretty extreme problem. But a lot of people are making mistakes due to outdated information, and that's it happens in medicine quite a bit, and their lives are literally on the line, and it's very problematic.
Yeah, it's not like something irrelevant like economics, right? I mean, this stuff matters.
Yeah.
So let's use that as a jumping off point to talk about how we get better at all this stuff, you know? And we were talking on the call when we were talking about this stuff a little bit about how to sort of, hacking the expertise system. How to become a better consumer of experts. I mean, we all kind of have our tricks, right? When you're reading an article, you read it and you say, implicitly, you're making a judgment call, right? You just read this and say, should I be listening to what this person has to say? Based on whatever argument I see them making, whatever bona fides, arguments from authority, whatever they present. But we all have our ways of hacking kind of the expertise system. But let's talk a little bit about how to sort of inoculate ourselves against experts. John, why don't you start us off? I mean, how do you think about it as you're sort of evaluating it? Whether it's an investment decision or others, but you're getting a flurry of recommendations and other things coming in at you. How do you go through the process of actually kind of hacking the system of experts?
Well, I think the two really important issues to look at relative to an expert, if you would, the supplier of expertise, is how was the person credentialed? In other words, how did you become labeled an expert? Mm-hmm. What was the basis upon which you became labeled an expert? Was there some type of methodology that you could get comfortable with gaining that? And how is that tested? What is the failure rate for this person? What were the failures that were involved? And linked with the failures is what's the reward system for the expert? Mm-hmm. How is this person really rewarded? What are they really trying to provide in terms of the driving force that causes them to do this? Is it a psychic reward? Is it a financial reward? Mm-hmm. Is it an ultimate reward in terms of being able to publish? What is the reward system? And the two, I think, get somewhat interlinked because to the extent that there is a penalty for failure, you need to understand that. How have they failed? What was the penalty for failing? Sure. How does that all interact relative to achieving a better outcome somewhere down the road?
Bethany, do you want? I mean, how do you think about it? I mean, you got all these people up to see their name cited in Vanity Fair. They're all, I'm an expert, I'm an expert.
Nobody wants me to quote them.
Oh, really? Okay, never mind then. Imagine you were that person then. So.
I guess I've always sort of approached it in two ways, and I've never thought about it in that way before. But the one is seeking out bias on all sides of an argument, and so there's always this criticism in the market. Well, he's biased, she's biased, he's long a stock, he's short a stock, and my basic view is I want everybody who's biased, but I want bias on every side of the argument because you're not going to find somebody who isn't. And I think sort of not uniquely, but I've always sought out the input, for example, of short sellers and actively sort of sought out people who are going to be on the other side of any story. They might not be right, but I want to know what they think so that I'm less likely to just reflect the views of the majority, the consensus view, which at least is in the market is usually wanting things to go up. So I try to find bias on all sides of any subject so that I can then weigh those arguments against each other. And then I guess I have another rule which is totally inefficient, but is just more. And it's basically if somebody will talk to me, I will talk to them and try to get out of them whatever I can. And I'm not sure that's useful for anybody because it is so inefficient. But the process of journalism is very inefficient. But the more people you talk to, the more you know. And you can never guess. I've found at least I am very surprised who I learn things from and who I learn key facts from. And you can't game that. I don't think there's any way of predicting it. Sometimes somebody's assistant at a company knows a lot more about what happened at the company than the person themselves does because they see it clearly. So the more inputs, the better.
I mean, I find it's really vital as much as possible when confronted with what appears to be a sweeping determinative generalization to really do your best in any field to figure out on what basis was that made. So let me give you like two examples of that. One which I wrote about, so I thought about. During the 2012 election, a lot of us heard, because it was repeated over and over, again, in a media context, but it became part of the political debate, no president has ever been reelected with an unemployment rate greater than 7.2%. Everyone sort of somewhat familiar with this? And it was repeated and incanted so much that it became a reason to pay attention to the monthly unemployment rate, and it was seen as this, that seems to be a statement of a high level of determination. The U.S. government didn't create an unemployment rate well until the 1940s, and certainly the Bureau of Labor Statistics did not publish one well until the 1950s. But let's just say for the sake of argument there was one circa 1948. Between 1948 and 2012, there were 16 presidential elections. 7 people ran for re-election, and 2 people lost, George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Carter. So to make the statement, no president has ever been reelected with an unemployment rate greater than 7.2% is basically to say, in the 2 times that happened, both guys lost. Now, that would have been a very different statement had it been portrayed as such, and would have carried far less weight, like, oh, okay, interesting. Jimmy Carter lost, and so did George H.W. Bush. We do this all the time. We make these absolutely firm statements, but if you really looked at the information that went into them, it is usually highly insufficient to make that. I mean, medical studies are like this all the time. Every time I read a medical study, like, doing such and such leads to a 25% greater chance of X, heart disease, whatever. 25% greater chance than what? If it's presented that way in a discussion, it seems like, oh, wow, I shouldn't do it. But if it goes from, 1 in a million to 2.5 in a million, I'm not sure that. Well, actually, that's not a 25% greater chance. It's a 250% greater chance.
Bigger one.
Which even sounds, oh my God, I shouldn't do that because there's a 250% greater chance that I'm going to have a hard time. So, I mean, obviously we can't always do that. Otherwise, we'd be spending all of our time parsing reality as it's presented to us. But to some degree, I feel like we do need to spend a lot of time being really careful about on what basis are these statements being made.
Sam, is the academic system better at kind of weighing and grading experts than other systems out there? I mean, it's in a sense kind of built around that idea. Is there anything we can learn from that? In terms of hacking our own consumption?
It should be better. But,
sounds like no.
Yeah, I would say no. I mean, there's certainly, depending on the field, there's little accountability for, and if you have a beautiful model and kind of it's internally consistent, it doesn't need to be right. It can just be interesting, and that's a little problematic. And you see that, and actually when you're talking about these, like looking at the inputs into a prediction or some sort of statement, you can see this a lot within academia, like when someone's creating a model. And right now, big data is very fashionable. And so people think, oh, the more data, the better. Unfortunately, oftentimes the data sets that are used by academics as well as people in industry, they're often highly biased. You can't necessarily measure what you want. You can measure what is capable of being measured. And so people think, oh, more data, it's better. I would rather have like medium-sized good data rather than like really big bad data. And I think this kind of thing happens all the time, especially within kind of the more quantitative fields within academia, where you can make a really nice story based on some inputs that aren't very good. And oftentimes, the more precise the story, the more often it should be ignored, because it's really, and there's no kind of like probabilistic sense. There's no sense of like the boundaries of what is actually possible, and that's really problematic. And I think within academia, there certainly isn't accountability in the sense of people making predictions and then losing their jobs. They're just making predictions and then publishing more predictions. And that's kind of interesting.
I want to give folks a chance to get in the conversation and share your own examples or ask questions, whatever you want. So we'll pass a mic around here in a second. I think we have a microphone somewhere in the room. And if you have any, just put your hand up and we'll bring a mic to you. Before getting to that, one guy who's had a kind of notorious reputation with this whole subject is Nassim Taleb. So Taleb has written about this extensively, most recently in his book, is it Anti-Fragility, right? Is that the name? Yeah, right. I always get my antis and non-antis. So in his notion, of course, is that the response to all of this, the correct sort of societal response or individual response to the fallibility of experts and the limits of prediction and the tendency of things to fail, is robustness, right? This idea that we should embrace things, try to find ways to make things more robust and expect things to fail and to be fragile. Is that a way forward? And rather than trying to just become better at weighing experts or hacking the expertise system or thinking through all of that, is the right approach to just say, what, financial, entities fail. I mean, your own firm can fail. I mean, so is being less reliant on things that don't fail would strike me as one way out of this box.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think that the complexity of systems today dictate that there's more opportunities for failure to occur, for it to occur in unusual ways and different ways that we just haven't predicted. And therefore, as much as we try to build in redundancies and anti-fragility, it's going to take a step in the direction of perhaps strengthening against past issues, but have we really predicted how interactions are going to change in the future and therefore truly make it that much less fragile? I think we'll just see an evolution of these systems. And that doesn't say that the search to create a more sound system isn't a good search, and there's going to be lessons learned out of becoming more sophisticated about thought in each of the layers of what's involved with the fragility of a system. So I think there are benefits out of the effort that's going, that he talks about making. Mm-hmm. But at the same point in time, I just think there's going to be failures that occur because of new interactions.
Having more things fail's got to be good business for you.
Definitely. It actually is. It's a pretty disheartening thing if you read George Bush's comments after the Enron scandal as he signed Sarbanes-Oxley into law, and then President Obama's comments on signing Dodd-Frank into law 8 years later, and there are remarkable parallels between the two, and it does raise a question. I think one of the dangers we engage in is this idea that we can regulate away all the problems, and we're always solving for yesterday's problem rather than whatever is coming around the pike tomorrow. And I think that's one big set of issues for the financial world. And I think another is just the limits of expertise of the people in charge of enforcing these rules. And just a couple of little anecdotes on that notion, but I'm sure you all have read about Bank of America's recent overstatement of its capital position. It turns out it looks like the Federal Reserve, either the examiners at the Fed either signed off on that or didn't look at the numbers. And what sort of faith should that give you in the enforcers of the expertise? And I think that kind of shows you the limitations of this, and maybe an acceptance of that rather than an argument that we've solved all the problems and the financial system is safe forever would be a healthier way to go.
I mean, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the issues, and it's interesting, Bethany, being trained in math, that has become much more endemic to our current world in a way that we don't notice because it is so woven into the way when we think of things, is this desire to have not just predictions as in what do we think are likely outcomes of societal development or a business model or an investment. It's the perceived need that there be a precise number affixed to that. So for a lot of human history, people did not, Pericles did not get up and go, we're going to, spend money on the Parthenon and fight the Persians because it's going to lead to a 4.7% chance that we're going to beat them you get my point. The idea that future outcomes have to be numerical and precise is what leads us to a lot of the issues we currently have, rather than directionality. One of the things I've written a lot about, which is interesting, is in February of 2009, President Obama gets up and says we're going to spend $787 billion and it's going to create or save 3.5 million jobs. This, by the way, and I'm not interested in whether or not we think that was the right thing or the wrong thing. What's interesting about it is a world in which we live in where the President of the United States makes a statement of future outcomes with such numerical specificity. It wasn't, we're going to spend a lot of money because things are bad and we need to spend some money to prevent them from getting worse, and I can assure you that 3 years from now, things won't be as bad as they are now because we will have taken action. That's a radically different statement about future outcomes than we're going to spend this specific amount of money and it's going to create 3.5 million jobs. Not a lot of jobs, not 3 million or so, not 3.4, not 3.6. 2 is too few, 4 is too many. And I think that's a really problematic aspect. I'm not saying that we cannot have very strong probabilistic senses of where things are heading, such that we either spend money, invest, make our own life decisions. But the idea that you can capture that with a number, and then you've attached a lot of financial resources to that number, that's where I think we get into massive amounts of problems, and it's very recent.
But isn't the specificity what forces the critical thinking, even if then you simply show the inputs? Because without specificity at the end, can you have critical thinking?
See, but that's the issue, right? In a system where you thought everybody's was working toward a common end that's good, we're going to make more money, we're going to spend public funds for greater outcome, then you might have a greater degree of allowing people for some of the fudge room, right? It's because we essentially don't trust. Yeah, if you gave politicians the right to say, I'm sure that if we spend $100 billion now, it's going to do us good in the future. The idea that it has to be tethered to the CBO or tethered to a number does create discipline insofar as it prevents them from being able to make promises that we could all make if we were not held to it.
And I think it also speaks to the fact that there are certain systems where it's simply not possible to make that precise of a prediction, and yet we want a very precise prediction. And so the people who are willing to make these very precise predictions, even if they're completely unfounded, they're the ones that are going to get the press. And I think and we have to be willing to say, sometimes we actually can't make a precise prediction, nor should we want one. But it's hard to kind of fight the drive and desire.
And again, if anyone has any questions, just raise your hand. We got a microphone right over here. So sure, go right ahead before I launch into my next. Right there on the right.
My question has to do with systems. You mentioned that there's very simple systems, very complex systems, and then there's systems in between that are the difficult ones to analyze. How do we know which system, or what are the metrics by which one can look at the systems and whether the system is evolving into a different type of system?
So I wouldn't say that. And the ones that are most complex are actually the ones in between. But it's based on the interconnections of the pieces. And so I think the more and the messier the types of interconnections of the individual components, those are the ones that are the hardest to work with. And they're very interesting. And you can still make...
Give an example, Sam.
Cities
or...
Yes, a city, or even just like and online social networks in terms of understanding how information spreads among people either online or just in the real world, or how diseases spread. And there are certain ways of kind of understanding these things in the aggregate, but understanding the details of how things are going to spread from person to person, or with cities, how cities grow and develop, or generate innovative ideas and grow and are productive. There are simple models that capture a certain amount of the variation and what's going on in them, but the details are incredibly complicated because they're so interconnected and they're so rich in their interactions.
We had another question over here, if we can bring the mic over. Right here.
Can you talk about the opportunity for improving outcomes by a better understanding of behavioral finance? It's gotten very trendy. Bethany, you mentioned talking to short sellers. I think good journalists, like good investors, have an even keel and are aware of confirmation bias and motivated reasoning, things like that can very much influence outcomes.
You want to take a shot at there, John?
Sure. So we've been doing a lot of work at our firm on behavioral skills development, and it's been a very concerted effort over the past 2.5 years. And we've employed a number of techniques to try to integrate the learning process into the teaching part of the process. So that what we found is that people respond much better if they journal their activities, journal their thoughts relative to a certain period of time. And then when they're faced with the same circumstances, or at least circumstances that wear the same kind of characteristics, They can look at the journal and come to conclusions about what worked and what didn't work. So behavioral ideas get a lot of play in the financial business today, the investment business, but we think there's a lot of work involved, and the ultimate challenge of it is we're not quite sure what the measurement period is. And this is the real trick. We're not quite sure what the cycle is that we should be evaluating whether a specific individual has in fact developed the ultimate skills that we want them to get to. We think they improve. We're just not convinced yet what the metricing of success is.
There is also just one issue there. So behavioral finance is having a certain degree of vote, right, which is the awareness that the notion of purely rational actors that maximize their own future return doesn't seem to pertain to actual human beings. And that's all fair and good. But the way in which we try to do that is we create these kind of test case experiments, and you ask a lot of people about what they would do, or you study a controlled group about how they behaved. And that can provide great insight. But we're a little bit at the risk now of going from that can provide great insight to that's just as determinative as the thing that we've rejected.
Right.
One of the great ones is moral philosophers talk about the trolley and the train problem. If you knew 5 people were going to die and there's one person on the track, do you pull a lever so that the one person dies and to save the other 5? And then there's another one which is called the fat man part of it. Would you push someone onto the track actively in order to save the same 5 people? And a lot of people won't push the person, but they will redirect the trolley. The point of that is it's a really interesting thought experiment, but most of us will never, ever, ever be in the situation. And how we would actually behave were we in that situation is much more mysterious than how we think we would behave in that situation. A lot of behavioral finance is much more about what you think you would do if X happened than what you would actually do when X happened. And then that's just a limitation that we can't actually do a lot of these thought experiments in real life.
And there's a pretty extensive body of research saying that we're not very good at predicting how we're likely to feel even if the desired outcome happens, which is creates sort of nested, deeply nested problems.
Well, not only that, I know a lot of these experiments, not only they're in very controlled circumstances, and some of these results are quite universal, but many of them, as far as we know, they hold for undergrads who are enrolled in psych classes who want beer money, and that's not really a good, well
You're saying
established.
I think that sounds pretty generalizable.
You never know, but and so there's and so I think trying to understand the biases in kind of how we think about behavioral psychology. And,
Totally worth rereading Lord Jim, Joseph Conrad's Lord Jim, which is basically about how a life shaped by how somebody reacts differently under pressure than they think they would act. So,
We have a question here in the back. I saw him. Yep, right here. Microphone coming.
I'd just like to get the panel's thoughts on the issue that as expertise has become more and more specialized, the cost of acquiring that expertise, such as it is, means that you are more and more likely to be associated with either one aspect or the other of the argument. I've done a lot of work in agriculture, and there's a lot in there. I mean, you can talk in vaccines, you can talk in any of these areas, and it just leads to a lot of the cynicism you're saying, where there are experts, there are people out there that might have information to be useful to us, but people just tend to write off an entire side or the other because in acquiring that expertise, they partnered with one side or the other.
Right, yeah, I mean, my thoughts about that are there is a high currency paid, certainly in business, politics, and media, for certainty, right? I mean, journalists do not usually, and I've been on both sides of this, but journalists do not usually call someone up to get the, I don't know. I mean, if a booker ever calls you up to do a 3.5-minute spot on CNBC and your response is, it's kind of complicated, you're not getting a lot of subsequent calls, and that's certainly true of business, right? I mean, if an analyst walks in at Man and says, it's an interesting company, they might go. There's not a lot of premium paid for shades of gray, except in local bookstores, and that's a whole other issue. And that's a problem, right? Because a lot of future outcomes exist in this interstice between certain and uncertain. And I think we would all be much better served. I mean, I've talked about this in an investing context. We don't have to do it at InvestNet in the same way, but if you're in a binary, should we buy, should we short, should we go long, kind of having the in-house maybe person is actually a really interesting concept, because the forcing people into channels of certainty, which I think is exactly what you're asking, does exactly that, and it creates this binary sense of that's going to be right, that's going to be wrong. Often, it's not quite so simple. even with the stock price, which is, it's right at the moment that it's right. But, then do you sell it? Do you buy it?
Yeah, I had a producer once at CNBC tell me that I was trying to provide some nuance in a conversation, and he said, no. He said, you have to remember, your audience is a bunch of people running through O'Hare with roller bags, and you need them to stop. So look, passionate and absolutely certain about whatever it is, and no one will remember a thing you said, but just make sure you sound damn certain about whatever it was.
Right.
And then, that's Boffle ratings right there. So.
Well, it's not particularly solution-oriented, but it's interesting if you think about the financial crisis. I mean, it's one of the most disheartening examples of the way certainty can get reflected, and even in something very important to understand. But in pretty simple terms, if you're on the left, you see it all as Wall Street greed. If you're on the right, you see it all as the fault of government intervention in housing, right? And so there are these two distinct prisms through which people see the same set of events, and I think that speaks to how ideology can shape expertise too.
And there's some really great research I saw from UCSD talking about how those ideologies are becoming even more entrenched, because it's much easier to find like-minded people now. Right? In the past, it might have been hard for me to find fellow disbelievers in the moon landing or something, right? I mean, who knew what those people were? But now all of a sudden I can find, whole websites devoted to it. We're all self-reinforcing. We're pretty happy people because, as far as we can tell, it's the truth, right? So yes, right here.
So does it get back to bread and circuses? Is that what we're really talking about? I'm sorry, it's deeply cynical, I know.
Yeah, I think human beings, back to some of what we've talked about in the panel, like wanting order and wanting systems. And I think the human desire for certainty about future outcomes is pretty well embedded in our past and in our kind of multicultural DNA. So I'm actually less cynical about that drive. I just think it's a drive that we need to somewhat combat. And within a science frame where it's a closed system, where some degree of predictability about outcomes, how much tension can this piece of steel bear for a skyscraper or a terrace? I'm replacing our terrace railing right now, and I have an 8 and 10-year-old. I don't want a lot of shades of gray about whether or not that railing is actually going to be okay. I don't want someone coming in and going, yeah, I think it'll be fine. So there are certainly areas where certainty and closed systems both demand it and can provide it. It's the extension of that throughout areas where that understandable desire is deeply in conflict, as you just mentioned, with the fact that it's not real. But I think that's just human. I think we need to create systems that offset that, because otherwise the inertia of all these things is to go in that direction.
We have a question here in the back. I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious thoughts about the use of prediction markets across some of these domains.
Yeah, anyone want to take on, you guys use prediction markets at all? I mean, I always joke, people always come along and say, I have this great prediction market for the stock market, and I'll say, you're going to be really disappointed to learn there actually already is a prediction market for the stock market. It's called the stock market. And but anyway, I mean, do you in the context of what you folks do you think about prediction markets at all?
Not in that sense. We have a big systematics business, and it models a lot of different assets, and then puts factors against those assets to try to understand the interactions of various factors against fundamentals and against pricing. It looks for momentum and value and a number of other different factors.
Prediction markets were really good where it was groupthink, where the decision of a group of people was in fact the thing that would determine an outcome. So prediction markets were good for elections, even better than polling, but I think they were good for elections because elections depend on what a bunch of people decide at a specific moment in time. I don't think prediction markets, which are really kind of a crowdsourced way for complicated system outcomes, are any, whenever you see, what is it, like the CNN ticker of, 27% of people believe the Malaysian plane won't be found, right? And I mean, I love that kind of line because it's sort of, no one knows anything about that, and yet someone did a poll to come up with an outcome, right?
Right. We've captured the spectrum of crazy. Right. Any other questions before we begin to wrap up? So let's sort of close this sort of conversation off because, I mean, we're all, I suppose, in some sense, maybe we're experts on experts. Have you become over the last, whether through this conversation or sort of as you think about this whole topic, have you become more or less cynical about the role of experts? I mean, is it something now where are you more cautious than you were, 5 minutes ago, a year ago, 6 years ago, about how you think about and use experts in your own work and in in your own time. How has your relationship with experts changed? Maybe just to wrap us up. John, do you want to start us?
More cynical than ever. The experts are morphing. If you look at the world of hackers, now they don't want to be known. They want to get into Target, steal a bunch of identities and leave. 10 years ago, they wanted to tell you they were in the system. Today, you'll never know if they had their way. Around the financial crisis, people who had ideas didn't want people to know about them. There's always been the idea of the non-consensus correct view is the most valuable, but I'd say more cynical than ever.
Bethany?
I guess I've always been cynical. One of my first jobs, well, not always, but one of my first jobs when I started as a young reporter was this column called Companies to Watch, and I had to pick 3 stocks every 2 weeks that were going to double or triple or quadruple in value in the next 6 months. And you guys think that sounds hard, but it wasn't. It was shockingly easy because there was just no shortage of experts coming by Fortune, from analysts who recommended the stock to mutual fund managers who would buy ratings on the stock to company management. And I would dutifully write up my little pieces only to watch in horror as the stock usually went in promptly the opposite direction. And so I've had this kind of built-in, I just skepticism about the limits of what people, even the best intentioned of people actually know from for a long time.
Zachary?
I mean, I am in awe of expertise that is hard-won and long-born of learning how to do something that requires high levels of skill in an immense amount of time. An expert chess player, an incredible craftsman, an incredible carpenter, someone who is, a mathematician. That kind of expertise is both invaluable and rare and awesome. So I'm not, I hope I'm never cynical about that and always in awe. Acumen about future outcomes of complicated systems is something I feel like none of us will ever have expertise about in the way that I just talked about. And I think in that sense, to be an expert about complicated systems it's not an oxymoron, but it's both unnecessary and misleading.
Sam?
So I think I'm hopeful, but it depends on the scale at which you're looking at it. So for example, in science, scientific experts might be wrong quite a bit, but science as a whole actually wants that. And so science as an enterprise, it's not necessarily just a body of knowledge. It's a framework for querying the world and kind of learning more. And so the best way to think about this is, this was brought home to me by a former professor of mine in graduate school. He told me this story that he was teaching a course on theoretical ecology, I think, and he came in, lectured on Tuesday, and the next day he read a paper that invalidated everything he had taught in the course the day before. So he went on Thursday to his class and said, "Remember what I taught you? It's wrong. But if that bothers you, you need to get out of science." And so I think, and that is ideally the best way to view knowledge, that it's constantly changing, it's constantly in draft form. And so even though individuals might be wrong, as a whole, the enterprise of knowledge and science can constantly move forward and get closer to some sort of truth.
Great. Well, thanks very much.
Are you more cynical about expertise, Paul?
I go through sinusoidal waves of despair. No, I'm not. I'm not. I mean, I think very much in Sam's mode, where I think it's become better at telling us when we're wrong. It's a lot harder to escape information about wrongness now than it was previously, and I think that's really important. But in general, I have to fight my cynicism on this thing. I think it's harder and harder than most. So. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for the panel for a great conversation. I hope you found it useful and not entirely wrong.